How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Sorry for the delay, everyone. We're working on a new technology platform. Google has turned off Hangouts with the YouTube simultaneous broadcast, so we're trying something new. So my apologies for the technical glitch. We're here after a long hiatus. My name is Dan Hushin. I'm the CTO officer here at DXC Technology. And in the DXC Tech Talk, what we're really trying to do is to talk about some very topical issues that are going on in technology and our viewpoint on how we're resolving some of these issues for clients and what we see coming next. I'm really excited as we move into this Tech Talk series yet again in really helping to bring the global scope and scale of DXC technology to our clients, our partners in the broader marketplace. What's what we do in these tech talks is we do about a 25-minute discussion with industry experts in these areas, and then we move into a conversation using a platform called Crowd Chat. What we'll do is actually continue this conversation in what's a recordable way, but also in a way that supports a simultaneous conversation. So that platform again is crowdchat.net/DXC Tech Talk, and it is up today. It is up right now while we have this meeting. So if you in the audience want to actually bring questions right to our speakers, we will incorporate those into the live broadcast. So with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and introduce our guests. The first guest that we have is Mark Hughes. He's the Senior Vice President, General Manager of our security group. He comes to us fairly recently from a major international telecommunications firm and truly has his thumb on the pulse of what is troubling both enterprises and service providers in the area of cybersecurity. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very great to be here.
And secondly, I have someone who's been working with me at DXC for 2 years. And it really is about 2.5 years that DXC has been in existence, which is fantastic. Chris Nokenved, Dr. Nokenved is an amazing guy. He is helping a number of clients with their most critical applications and processes. At DXC, we call this enterprise cloud applications, but these are really the SaaS providers and the enterprise process providers that underpins the world's largest enterprises. And he brings a very specific view in terms of enterprise risk and performance right to the table. So welcome, Chris. Chris? All right, well, we will get going. I'm sure Chris is here and will join in shortly. So let's just start out. Mark, right? So, you know, one of the biggest problems in cybersecurity today is culture, right? What does a resilient culture, cyber resilient culture, really look like to you?
With Dan, I mean, it's so many different things, but look, if I had to nail it down to just a few, which we haven't got all day, it is about really building in the cyber, if you want, building blocks right the way through the CIDC engineering process. So when I see organizations that really do things really well are the ones where you don't need to do a lot at each stage, but you need to be very deliberate in what you are doing. So culturally, those organizations that come from a heavy engineering background, you mentioned earlier on that I came to DXC from telco. You know, there's a lot that happens in telco which is very established, very deliberate. Where getting to a point of being able to establish a cyber culture, a cyber resilient culture, if you want, lends itself to that type of environment. In the way in which deliberate engineering, good engineering practice has been there for some time, but that's not really the whole story, because most organizations don't want to work in that deliberate waterfall type way necessarily. So what I see therefore is those organizations that are really building building in cyber considerations. As I say, they're not big things per se, but they just need to be done at the right time in the life cycle, so that then as organizations move through their product from development into test, from test into the dev and then into production, that they then can actually make sure that what they have has the basic building blocks in place. So that's a bit about some of the basic engineering stuff that needs to be done. But also, and it's a strange thing for me to say here, Dan, but in my experience, those organizations that have suffered or have had direct experience of something which has impacted them from a cyber point of view, and I really encompass cyber as something that is something that normally gets done to you as opposed to something that you do to yourself. The net result may well be the same in terms of an availability outcome, but those organizations that may have been impacted by something in the cyber sphere are ones which have worked out the fact that they now need to rewind, look at how they're doing stuff, and then make it a much more resilient type of culture. So in sum, good engineering and direct experience helps. And if you're in the lucky position not to have had direct experience, drawing on expertise either from cross-industry, but more importantly from that specific industry sector, and having the right people in the organization that can be horizon scanning and then informing those processes to ensure that they're embedded.
Yeah, so for me, there's a critical word here, which is kind of resilient. And there's another thing that you brought up, which is kind of the SRE style, right? The site reliability engineering style, right? And you mentioned CI/CD. These are continuous integration and continuous delivery, right? Processes that many companies are moving to in the agile style. So let's really dig into resiliency, because I think that there's something very important in demystifying cybersecurity for most employees, which is kind of shifting from the you should be afraid, right, to this notion that fear is okay or failure is okay, but it's how you recover and your ability to recover quickly, right, that I think begins to define resiliency, right? And anything in that, I mean, you mentioned the fact that you need to continuously inform. I think that's part of moving from fear to action. But is there anything else that you guys are really talking about? Dr. Chris has joined us again, so thank you, Dr. Chris.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. So anything
Well, I
in that
mean,
word resiliency that's important?
yes, I
Yeah,
think it is. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
on that point, I think you make a really, really strong point there, Dan. It is the fact that we in IT do a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily go right all the time. Let me put it that way. And so having a cadence in an organization that is used to having to respond to stuff when things don't quite go as you expect is something that we all have, and many different organizations approach it in different ways. So a cyber resilient piece, as I said, is generally comes from the fact that a lot of the actual risk manifests itself from outside the organization, but often the net result is the same. So one of the things that I think you're absolutely right in is we don't need to consider this as being something scary, new, full of fearsome type stuff. The reality is where the rubber hits the road in terms of how you then orchestrate and manage the required output when something isn't going right. We're quite used to that. So making sure that you can contextualize that within cyber stuff, because as I keep on saying, often this comes from outside the organization, but nonetheless, the impact is felt within the organization, service delivery normally, and being able to respond and being able to effectively manage incidents in that way, which we should all be pretty good at in any case, is where your resilience is drawn from. And so my advice is for anyone who's listening is basically to say, look, guys, make sure that you use what you've already got and use that in a way that can help you really recover from, because in cyberland, stuff's going on all the time. And we can't expect that we're just going to keep it all out, because that's not how it works. But that being able to respond is often the best mitigation tool that you've got, as well as obviously having some proactive type controls in place as well.
So,
well, let me add a couple of comments. I think from an enterprise applications perspective, a decade ago, if you ask a large CPG company what was the most confidential information that they had that shouldn't actually leave the company, right? It was primarily patents. It was primarily manufacturing recipes, right? That was it, right? The rest, like finance and distribution, logistics, sourcing contracts, all of this was interesting. many of the events in the transactional systems interesting too, but not really groundbreaking. Now, if you come to where we live today and the kind of systems that we're dealing with, there's a lot of private information in these companies' archives. If you think about Nestle and Nespresso, right? They are running subscription services. So basically they are allowing you to subscribe to your flavors of Nescoffee, right? From your mobile phone. A lot of that information that is not just transactional, it's also behavioral, is suddenly in the ether, right? They need to ensure privacy. They need to ensure GDPR. If you look at Oracle, Microsoft, Dynamics, and also SAP, all of them have done significant acquisitions in the GDPR space and also in the cloud space to be able to secure data. That's point number one. Point number two, a lot of the data that is driving transactional systems is not coming from the transactional systems themselves. It's coming from data lakes. It's coming from events. A truck is broken, right? Or the freezer in the truck between Mumbai and Pune with fresh fish is actually not working. We're not supposed to deliver rotten fish, right? This kind of information is actually driving the kind of information we need to access. Now, that kind of information, some of that information, if you look at telecoms, if you look at oil and gas, can be very sensitive. And we need to ensure that even employees are not going to be tampering with that data, right? So encryption is becoming literally built in the base of the applications today. They were not there a decade ago, but it's now.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big shift that I'm seeing in the enterprise and SaaS applications.
So that's awesome, Dr. Chris. As we conquering risk is like this, trying to hit a moving target, right? And I think everyone's begun to recognize that, there's no such thing as zero risk. You can never get to zero risk, or it's cost prohibitive too. And so I think when we talk about resilient cultures, we begin to talk about, a confidence in our ability to respond, and maturing that segment, right? Because if I can't get rid of all the risk, then what I have to do is actually figure out, how do I respond more consistently, correctly, quickly, right, to these to the threats or challenges, right? I mean, enterprise risk isn't just about cyber risk; it's operating risk. To your point,
Exactly.
Dr. Chris, right? It's strategic risk, right? Where a competitor can make a move, and your ability to quickly and confidently counter that move becomes important. So, what are you guys seeing in terms of how organizations are building their resilience, building their confidence in their ability to respond, the speed, the consistency, the correctness?
Yeah. So look, Dan, I'll take that. I'm seeing some really consistent things, and I think the thing that is worth pointing out here, and we stick out a threat intel report every month, and I just been looking through some of the stuff that I've seen in that, and other sources as well, and we continue to see ransomware high up the list. And I mentioned ransomware specifically in this context because increasingly with the, as I described, weaponization of availability. In the past, a lot of the cyber related stuff was really around what we describe as confidentiality related stuff. Chris was talking about how applications can be vulnerable, how transactions can be vulnerable, how that data becomes vulnerable and then potentially usable to adversaries. What we've seen in the last couple of years, for anyone on the call here, they'll know that the sort of WannaCries, NotPetya's, the names that we've probably heard quite a bit about, very much concentrated around availability. And to Dan, what I'm seeing now is organizations have had a real rude awakening, because cyber is no longer just about we've lost some information. No, that was really serious, but required a different response from where you have core infrastructure being targeted and becoming unavailable, because we all know that. And we live with that all day, every day. So what I see is those organizations that can get hold of their response capability, their instant response capability, that they can manage it and manage it well, are much, much better positioned to recover from a shock. And very specifically, to your point, the thing that I see where organizations have not worked out how to integrate the both the cyber response and the, if you want, normal IT response together, so that there is one instant management process, well understood, that the response and playbooks are well written in. Where that is not in place, confusion reigns, and therefore they're losing valuable time to then potentially respond. So that's one thing. Very briefly, the second thing I would point to is, in some cases, getting advice from peers in industry, from national cyber authorities, for example, when it comes to that type of stuff, is pretty important. And the time to try and make those connections and work out how others are responding to stuff is not during an incident. So needing to have a network well set up, some of it automated nowadays with sticks and taxi type protocols in place, is extremely important. That stuff all needs to be thought through deliberately and playbooks developed within that single incident management wrap in an organization. And that is, in my view, what sets apart those organizations that are inherently more resilient, because they're better to respond to some of this type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mark, you brought up earlier, right, this kind of notion of CI/CD, right? And for those of you, right, in the audience who aren't quite there, right, the notion is that when a developer actually develops software, right, they can actually check in their code and have a robot build their code and then test their code. And when you move into CD, that fundamentally means that I don't just integrate my code, but I actually deliver that code, right, to a running system, to operations. And as a result, as the marketplace has moved to these software disciplines where you are able to have robots actually deliver known good systems, and you have reduced your release cycle from once a quarter and an A/B switch on a test rig, which becomes a production rig, to now with cloud being able to actually test the code 100,000 times a year, it changes everything. So Chris, tell me what some of your clients are doing with CI/CD and SRE, and how is their world changing when it comes to bringing cyber into that landscape?
Hmm. Well, DevSecOps is hot, as we call it in the market, right? DevSecOps, that means we introduce security into the development process from day one.
Mm-hmm.
There is the trend of doing TDD, test-driven development, as most people have heard of. But there is a notion in some of the advanced enterprise I'm working with, especially public sector, with very sensitive information, where they're dealing with literally SDD, right? Security, literally set the security perimeters of who is supposed to access the data, and then make it part of the test case from day zero, basically, before you start coding, right? These are typically things we do after the fact, right? And as we're exposing, if you take SAP, there are around 9,600 Fiori interfaces, HTML5 interfaces. That means you can run the whole company from a mobile phone, right? If you make amendments to that, if you don't secure the connections, if you don't secure the code that you have been writing, that provides an easy access for people, right? If they can just connect to your phone. And this is not unusual. So the best practices that I have seen is, 5 years ago, use Fortify. Today, they are literally deploying SDD from day zero. So just as well as you do behavioral testing, you do your code testing, you also do security testing. But the security is the actual outer perimeter of everything. And this is something very new for many people.
Right. So yet another non-functional requirement, right, that becomes just part of your developer, your developer expectation, and it realizes itself into a lower risk, but also an improved ability to respond, right? Because if you get confident, right, that you can redeploy a change into production much more quickly, then even a small update, upgrade, library change, right, becomes kind of a non-event, right? And it's not an emergency because you've gotten so good in actually delivering changes to your application, and within an operating day, even in a closed change cycle for a business. So an important facet. We are seeing, right, some other changes, right? Mark, you guys have really been a leader, I've seen, in right, bringing IT and cybersecurity together. I think we've seen a history over the past 10 years of having a cyber team who keeps an eye on the business and the threats to it. And now with this new world of resiliency, right, cyber kind of has to get closer to where the changes are occurring. So can you talk a little bit about what DXC is doing, right, with its cyber program and how we're closing the gap between IT and security?
Yeah, great question, Dan. And I think that's really where this nexus of the concept of cyber resilience really comes in, which is that, hitherto I think there's been a lot of security stuff done, and we can see that in the manifestation of tooling that exists in most organizations where it's done for the sake of security. And, I always maintain that most security gets done, as Chris was just alluding to, not in security. There's some policy sets that are driven, there's some intel that needs to be gathered, there's some interpretation and correlation of events to then tee up something. And it's the something, I think, that has been, in my mind, missing that intersect between the IT and security worlds. So the work that I'm doing and the team we're really focused on here is to say every security action needs to have a corresponding outcome somewhere. So, okay, so we're correlating some data. We see that there may be some stuff that may be out of band that we're looking at and thinking, oh, what is that about? Well, what does that mean? What action are we going to take? And the world, I think, where it might sound relatively rudimentary, but most organizations really still struggle with this, which is, for example, the world of vulnerability scanning, usually a security tool that is deployed across an estate, and then the world of then how you remediate potential vulnerabilities that's throwing out. So patching. And that is something that pretty well in my experience, every organization is struggling with. They all now have passive and now increasingly active vulnerability scanning tools around, authenticated scanning tools as well, that basically are giving you relatively granular information. But we're still at the place where correlation of hosts back to contextualized information that allows you to decide what to do is still hard to understand, often spread around an organization. So just being able to cut down that time from identifying where there may be vulnerabilities and then being able to take the remediation action is one small example of where we're now seeing the worlds really coming together, and just great revelations of effort, especially when we overlay automation into there as well. Great revelations, as I say, in the sense that organizations collectively breathing a sigh of relief, going, I'm now putting more and more tooling in that's telling me that I've got potentially more and more vulnerability, but I have no way to deal with that constant refrain of more and more vulnerabilities stacking up. What we're at and what we've developed through our platform DXC using Bionics as well is to now be able to automate all of that as far as possible. It won't be 100% automation. There's always going to be things where you look at and think, I really do need to apply some judgment into what we might and might not do, because as we know, going through heavy lifting patching routines can be extremely potentially service impacting if you're not careful. But in the main, taking away as much as we can of the thousands and thousands of types of vulnerabilities is a huge step forward. So that's one small example. And there are so many more, Dan, that we're getting after now with use cases and playbooks to really resolve for bridging that gap that hitherto has been basically a bit of a chasm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the areas for me, Mark, that you've really, honed in on, right, around this notion of closing the gap, right, is in what you guys have done with ServiceNow incident response, right, which we now, in terms of our operating platform, are branding ISecOps. And the model there is really interesting because recognizing that operations is something that everyone in the company does, right, bringing the data from IT, right, whether it's application logs or infrastructure logs, changes and change management, right, under a commons, right, for the company. And security is now just a participant in the commons. So even your threat vulnerabilities are becoming available to developers, or vice versa, right, that IT information and change management is available to security, right, that's beginning to change. So any initial success stories around ISecOps that you can, bring forward?
Absolutely, that patching one is the one that I would point to straight away. I've seen just literally a huge size of relief in many organizations that we're working with now, where we're taking the ability to remediate through the ServiceNow tooling of Qualys output, for example, where we've integrated that in, where we now do one of two things, depending on where the client is on this, either an automated remediation, so right the way through to actually applying the patch, or a tee up in the change management window to then be able to tee up when that patching happens. That workflow alone, Dan, one small example, is saving some organizations that we're running that for now just years almost of work time, of people work time, just because of hitherto it used to genuinely be run through a bunch of spreadsheets, and that was, in some cases not even then. So there's one small example of how that ISecOps, that intelligent security operations, using the ServiceNow workflow, is already automating some of that. But many more to come, many more things on their way as well. They're not just within that environments as well.
The really cool thing there, in my view, right? Not only are Qualys reports really unbearable, right? Because they'll give you, 6,000 vulnerabilities that you have to figure out how to distribute into your organization for remediation. But you also have to actually track that they're closed. And so, this is where a traditional ITSM tool becomes really good, because you can raise tickets, right, through Qualys. And when you close a ticket, whether manually or automated, right, you actually update the CMDB. And so what's happened, right, is we've created a model in which we're now round tripping the changes with full transparency to the whole organization of exactly what's been done, in the same way that IT operations would previously have been working. So we're starting to run out of time, but there is one question, right, from the audience. So I actually want to bring this out, and maybe both of you guys answer it, but maybe Chris, maybe you want to take a start. Right, the question is, every part of your organization needs to be fortified, but where do you start? Right, I mean, starting is always a hard discussion, right? Because it can be a quick answer is it probably depends, but are there really any low-hanging fruit that we're really seeing that becomes important for companies to keep an eye on or focus their initial changes?
That was a wonderful question I once got around Salesforce, where people were saying that Salesforce will never be a success because it's the most sensitive information in a company. It's the sales records. What are we doing, right? What are we selling? But it proved an error. Salesforce has been growing to 10 billion soon. So it's not true. I think the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out what is the kind of information, at least in a company's domain, because there's a lot of other information, but within a company's grasp, control, and responsibility. What is the information that will have truly detrimental effects to the performance of the company? If you're developing a new product or an enhancement to a product, and suddenly you lose your patent or somebody's messing around with the ingredients in a chemical or a medicine, can you imagine the consequences to the company? So you really need to start at the places where there is the most value to lose if someone get access and can tamper. Now, people laugh today about this medicine thing, but I'm thinking about driving and algorithms. Can you imagine if someone tampers with your algorithms in your car, right? I mean, this becomes a real big issue. Algorithmic security is becoming probably the next big thing, right, Mark?
Yep. And adversarial AI.
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah.
So Chris, so you say, know your information, right? Know the value of the information, and work against that, the higher value information, right? The more strategic value on that information, right? To close the gap. So Mark, how about you? What would your answer be to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Chris on understanding having a risk framework that can identify and deal with that. Few other things that I would point to, though, and I'm going to be a bit boringly specific here because there are things that I see organizations get tripped up on. Access. Get your identity and access management right. It is that is generally what trips up most organizations. It's a hard thing to get right. We're all, probably everyone for the audience, in some 365 migration, so you're all fiddling around with Azure Active Directory, ADFS, all the other things that go around that. Take that opportunity to relook at access. I would say encrypt that once you've identified, as Chris was saying, that data, encrypt it, both in transit at rest. There's plenty of tools out there that can do that now. And then finally, this is not exhaustive. This is just a few things the person who asked the question asked for. Make sure you get your endpoints under control. Again, a lot of the ingress for a lot of the attackers, be it ransomware and all that availability related stuff, all the confidentiality related attacks comes in through the endpoint often. So just making sure that the endpoint is clean, it's not overburdened, and you've got some decent agents that you can then do stuff with and isolate and detect where necessary. And then I will obviously finally say, monitor it all and be able to respond. Back to what we were saying earlier, Dan. So those are a few things. Actually, when you drill down on those, there are just a few things, but you need to get them done and get them done right comprehensively. there are many other things that can be done, but those are my few things that would be top of my list.
So I'll wrap you and Chris up into the final remark, right? So know who is in your environment, know what the information is and its value, right? And then monitor, right, that the appropriateness, right, of the access of those identities to that information, so, and manage that connection. Good summary?
Indeed.
Absolutely
All right.
perfect.
And I'm going to add in my piece, which is really you have to modernize your IT. Right, moving your environment to areas in which you can safely, correctly, and consistently make small changes and get them back into deployment creates an agility and a business productivity benefit. So it's not just a tax. You're actually going to find that the company can do more with less, which means you can prosecute more of your overdue homework. And so if you can, get your identity infrastructure right, get your information in the right places, and then change your culture to working quickly using fully modern and automated tools, I think that you begin to really create a resilient organization, right, that we've been talking about, in which a network outage or a cybersecurity outage are dealt with the similar response of let's redeploy the code. We know how to do it. There's a confidence in that, and the organization begins to just behave differently. So I want to thank our guests, Chris and Mark, for coming with us this morning. Right now, what we're actually going to do is we're going to actually break over right to the crowd chat platform where we're going to answer the last questions. And I will remind everyone that happens to be listening to us today, we are at crowdchat.net/DXCTechTalk. We'll be doing this now monthly on a go-forward basis. And you can actually pick up all of the residual tech talks that we've done at dxctechnology.com/DXCTechTalk. So thanks very much, and we will see you on CrowdChat.
Thank you.